Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and today I'm bringing you a bit of a special video. We're coming to the close of Valorant's first year as a professional esport, and as shown through all of my videos thus far, we've already created quite a history when it comes to the metagame evolution of this game. I wanted to take a minute here as we close out this year to look back over the metagame of Valorant and how it's changed over time, as well as talk to a couple of cool guests along the way who are critical in making that evolution happen. Let's hop right into it. To start us off, I wanted to talk about the first major compositional meta that we ever saw in Valorant, and for that we have to go all the way back to open beta and the Common Core. For those of you who have been around since the beginning of this channel, the Common Core should not be an unfamiliar name to you. It's the name that I assigned all the way back in April to the composition of Breach, Brimstone, Cypher, and Sage that was becoming an unstoppable force in early beta tournaments. While attributing this composition and its evolution to any one team in particular would be a little foolhardy, there were definitely a couple of major names that played critical roles in its rising to prominence. A lot of those names, while familiar back then, have also changed quite a lot since. We have then Mousespaz, which is now TSM, the French Canadians, which is now Gen G, T1, which has gone through a number of evolutions itself, and countless Tier 2 teams that, while they certainly have continued to mix players, still have a noteworthy presence in the modern day game. While this Common Core meta wasn't exactly anything to write home about, what it was the first. It was the first compositional metagame that really drove Valorant forward and established a core operating process to the way that teams were tackling the game. And while it's almost entirely gone now, the last vestiges of it being solely really on Bind, where we still see that Brimstone Breach combo coming out on a recurrent basis, it still will always have its place as the start of Valorant's history. Moving on from the Common Core, we go from something that now is almost entirely lost and only appearing on very rare occasions. We look at something that still to this day defines the overwhelming majority of Valorant's gameplay. That thing, catalyzed by the release patch 1.00, was the significant changes to Omen and the introduction of what I call Omen Standard, the Omen heavy intel metagame that we see even now. And while certain parts of Omen Standard have certainly changed, it used to be that you would be seeing Cypher, Omen, Sova, and Sage, and now you see far more prominently Cypher, Jet, Omen, Sova. The premise remains, and this is the longest-lived metagame composition that we have seen throughout Valorant's history. That's not to say, though, that there weren't fast and slow movers when it came to adopting this meta shift. There are certainly a couple of teams that I personally credit with spurring it forward in their respective regions. You have folks like Brax in North America, as well as Latex in EU, and those two, as well as their teams T1 and Fabrican, were really the spear points when it came to integrating this in their regions. Speaking of Fabrican, this is where we're going to hit the first meta shift that really boils down to being credited to, I would say, almost exclusively a singular team, and that's the introduction of the Sageless metagame in Europe. To help us better understand this Sageless meta that came to Europe, I have one of the prime culprits himself, Eric Sandgren, also known as Doombros. At the time, he was co-coaching Fabrican with his brother Emil, and nowadays is the analyst for Fun Plus Phoenix. So, first off, thanks for hopping on with me. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
So, going through this timeline that this video is covering, I'm talking about all of the major metagame shifts that have happened in Valorant's history thus far, and looking back, you and your brother with Fabrican were really one of the critical pivot points in that you were one of the driving forces that made teams stop playing Sage. At that point in time, I mean, we're looking all the way back at something like the Vitality Open. What made you guys willing to drop the Sage at that point when everyone else was seemingly still playing it?
Yeah, so I think the idea originated from a few points. I think it was one day we were going through Bind, and The meta at the current time, if you remember, was you took sites with Sage, right? You walled off the plant and you planted the bomb, and you didn't care about the rest of the site. So the meta was kind of get the bomb down, don't have any map control, and just play out of the after plant, right? So what we thought, if you want to break the meta, I think Sova is by far the best agent in the game. Okay, so you have to have Sova. You kind of have to have some kind of flash, and you have to have some way of taking backside, right? And I think taking backside from a range is far superior than doing it, for instance, with a Phoenix. So the idea was just, okay, we need to take more map control. We need to break this expectation of them thinking we're gonna wall off the site, because when people play in positions that are bad for the breach comp, we just thought, okay, we can get a much more value from a breach here than a Sage. Sage doesn't actually bring too much to the attack and to the defense, and didn't justify us picking it at all, you know. Just also how we play it, since I think Sage is a highly reactive character. Like, you have nothing kind of proactive with her. You have to have some kind of alert, especially on defense. You kind of have to have some kind of alert to what is happening, and then put down your utility and react to it. So she was also very weak to like this contacty, defaulty playstyles that we had back in Fabriken. So it just made sense, and it worked, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Also, sort of touching more on that playstyle that you had with Fabriken, when it came to your defensive halves, you played very heavily into retaking a lot of the time. Did that factor at all into the way that Sage didn't or did fit into your team's playstyle?
Yeah, for sure. Right. Because at the time, we kind of found out that, especially on bind, when you wall off yourself on attack, so when we're on defense and the guys coming in and walling off themselves, we're kind of screwing themselves over, right? Because we could just play hard plant denial with utility, get maybe 1-2 picks before we plant, and then just play retake in advantage. And we just did that for all sides. So on one side, you could have a setup with a camera with Cypher, right, and Breach, because that's one of the strong suits. You can have an aggressive defense with setups, right, with a camera. And on the other side, you can kind of play retakey, plant denial, get some kills when they play the Sage, and then you just retake him advantage and either push on the other side or just retake S5, and Breach is probably the best retaker in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking back on that time myself from my own personal recollection, I remember watching the first couple of matches where you guys were playing this style and being blown away by really the discipline involved in saying, yes, we're just going to concede this site because we know for a fact that if we come back around to it, we'll be in a better spot than you are. Doombros will be back a little bit later for some input on another topic, but for now we're going to move on to the next big step in Valorant's meta, which is one of my personal favorites, the introduction of Viper on Split. For this segment, I'll be bringing in my good friend Salah Barakat, who was the original coach for Team Bonk, now Team Guild, and has also spent his time since working with Bonk, coaching teams most notably FaZe here in North America. So, in this video, I am going over basically an exhaustive history of the major meta shifts throughout Valorant starting at beta and coming to current day, and one of these segments that pertains greatly to your personal background is back in the day when Bonk first was bringing out Viper on Split. Sort of kick us off on that, who was the main catalyst for sort of bringing Viper into the Split comp in the first place?
If I remember correctly, Bonker and Yasin, after the split nerf or after the split change that removed that wall in mid, they saw that Viper Smoke as a way of kind of replacing that wall and making a pseudo wall in mid, and they really liked it for that reason. She also added some nice stuff with the ultimate, and it also gave Safe nice ways to. I think he played it really nicely. I think the way he played it was kind of like a big thing. I don't know if someone else could have picked it up and played it like that, but I think we just liked it because of that mid thing it did in Split, basically. The way we were able to lock down Split with Raze and Viper.
Well, we'd definitely seen Viper been pulled out by other teams prior to this. You were sort of the first team that actually made it work. Was there any particular things that you guys utilized from her in particular that made that success happen? Was it something like that mid-smoke, or were there other sort of niche uses that you guys had that really made it something special?
Again, I think like the big part of it was the mid smoke. I think that's why we liked it so much, at least, if I remember correctly. I think with like everything else, like we used it, for example, on attack, we allowed Safe to kind of play that B lobby area, and every single round he would wall in a certain way and kind of get out being. He would either get a pick or die, but most of the time he would get a pick and he would work it really nicely. He'd always get the orb. So it basically, first of all, just allowed him to always like have ultimate a lot because he was able to snow just getting every single round. And second of all, it allowed like us a lot of B pressure and made it much easier to do our stuff. For example, we really like to get Raze and Cypher into A Heaven and stuff like that. So I think like on attack, we really liked it, like how it worked. It could get a bit solid sometimes. So I think Split was like, we tried on Bind as well, but Split was the one place your attack doesn't need to be amazing. I think on defense, like that mid thing again, like he worked mid a lot and he would kind of use that smoke. He'd put it down the left as that mid wall, and then he'd either jump inside it, and then he had like a trick where he'd get onto the barrels without making sound, or he'd work it, or he'd say that with Yasin, and basically just allowed us to focus on other areas of the map with other characters because we knew we had a Viper with all of our utility there, and it could get very annoying pushing.
I guess sort of to close the loop on Viper on Split, there are a couple teams that are still running it. I mean, we've seen it integrated by teams like Andbox over in NA. Do you think that a lot of these powerful elements of Viper are still relevant? Do you think that like mid-smoke setup still has a lot of potency, or do you think that the Split meta has evolved a lot to the point where Viper maybe isn't such a great pick on it anymore?
The thing is with the way the Valorant is, a meta can change, or the way something works can change without really any prompt. For example, people can just get very used to that Viper mid because play it. Sometimes things can just get found out or get old or get stale. So right now, whether those things work as well as they did, I have no clue. They could if they were given the right hands. It's just because maybe there are things that can do what she did better, or for example, there's a different idea you want to have. I think that was the thing with characters like Viper and other characters that were deemed bad at the start, was you could always find a way to make them work. It was just about what were you going to give up? What were you going to drop for a Viper on Bind, for example? What were you going to drop for this character here? When you have like Sova, you have like all these basically A-tier characters. I think that's the big thing. I think every agent actually works.
Now that we've seen two meta shifts that were almost exclusively spurred by Europe, it's time to travel roughly halfway around the planet to Japan and Korea, where we see the introduction of the Southeast Asian Jetdive, the now infamous Vision Strikers style of play. Jetdive, which really made its first high-profile appearances in the first Clan Masters events, was characterized by a dedicated flasher, typically a breach, as well as a jet, and while this combination had absolutely been seen time and time again, the way that they played it with such unbridled, aggressive set plays set it apart and earned it the name of Jetdive. Whether it be because of the flashiness or just the sheer shock factor of this kind of aggression, it made names for a couple of players that really now are held in some of the highest regard in their role across all of Valorant for those who know them. You have top-tier Breach players like Stax and Esperanza, and you have some of the best Jets globally like Depp, RB, and Raita. And while this style certainly had its beginnings in Asia, it is now one of the most far-flung stylistic shifts that we saw in Valorant's metagame since day one. You would now be hard-pressed to watch any tournament and not hear at least once through the duration of the event a color commentator say that a team pulled out a Vision Strikers play. And now that we've dipped our toes in the Pacific a bit, it's back across the planet to Europe again. It's time to touch on something that has caught Valorant headlines around the world, and that is Team Heretics and their, pun intended, resurrection of Sage. Since patch 1.0, Sage had more or less been gutted from the metagame. And when I say gutted, I mean really gutted. That's not necessarily due to the fact that she was nerfed to a state where that was warranted, but public perception for many months at this point was that Sage had been brought to an unplayable state. One team that was unshaken by this public perception, however, was at the time Team Inferno. Starting as early as Level Clash 2, Team Inferno was showcasing a willingness to continue to pull out Sage at the highest levels of play, albeit to somewhat uninspiring effect. After being swiftly dismissed during the group stage of Level Clash, it was on to First Strike before they would make another major appearance. In this next appearance, however, it was under a new banner, now Team Heretics. While flying mostly under the radar, there had already been whispers of some of Heretics' dominance coming out of their potent results in some smaller tier 2 events like LVP events out of Spain. It would be at First Strike, however, where they would change the status quo so that under the radar would never be a term you would assign to them again. Heretics would go on to play Sage, without exception, the entire main event of First Strike, toppling super giants like Team Liquid and G2 along the way. Their out-of-left-field utilization of Sage is believed to have caught many teams off guard, seemingly having forgotten how to play against this pick, and Heretics brought numerous innovations to the table as well. They would frequently play aggressively for early space, while off that space, and functionally deny teams of pre-execute positioning, as well as allow themselves very easy orb farm, unlocking things like Sage's powerful Resurrect. And they would also use the more obvious parts of Sage's kit, like slow orbs to disrupt execute timings, something that had become an incredibly powerful wrench in the works of most teams. The perfect person to discuss this kind of timing disruption further we had on just minutes ago. Welcome back, Doom Bros. We're here again to talk about Sage a little bit on the flip side compared to what we were touching on earlier, though, in that where we discussed your team and their removal of Sage from the metagame initially, we're now talking about Team Heretics and how they're bringing it back in and finding extremely high rates of success with it. I wanted your thoughts on why you believe this is possible, in spite of the initial movement that you and your team spear pointed.
Yeah. And I mean, now it's going full circle where it's good again to kind of not play retake anymore, but to play hold instead, and just disrupting the enemy team, because more and more teams are kind of skipping the default stage of the game on attack. They're kind of just executing on the the first ability cycle, right? And in that case, Sage is really good because she's someone who is good at, okay, we're executing now in cycle 1, and she uses one ability and it destroys their whole setup, right?
Yeah.
And for instance, Liquid, why they lost, I think, to the Sage, is also because they haven't practiced enough on the mid game, the default stage, the cycle 2 of the game, right? They only do these set executes that they have practiced, and as soon as you take them out of the comfort zone and play this defaulty contacty style with a Sage, it makes the game so much harder.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a perfect way of putting it. Once again, across the sea, we find ourselves in North America to discuss the Triple Duelist meta. Triple Duelist had certainly been played in the past of Valorant far prior to this, even in fairly high-level play by teams like Team Liquid in EU, but it was really in North America that Triple Duelist found its footing. And so to elaborate a bit more on this, we're going to bring back Sala to discuss his time in NA. Welcome back, Sala. You were coaching FaZe at the point in time in which Triple Duelist really sort of landed in and started making an appearance in North America. What was your experience with Triple Duelist at that time?
It was something we were experimenting a lot with FaZe, especially we were doing it a lot on Split and Haven, I think, very early on the scrims, about like towards the start of my tenure, towards the start when I started doing work with them. It was generally like on Haven, for example, we did it in a way where it was just about aggression. It was about like how much explosivity you had. It was about being able to kind of do this lurking style across the map, because you have, when you have agents like Phoenix and you have agents like Jet and Raze who can get in and out very quickly, or get in quickly, or kind of just pop on a certain map, it's nice to have them lurking around or be across the map and just have this like clamp on the map, if that makes sense. That was kind of the idea behind it when we were at least experimenting with it.
Knowing what you do about Triple Duelist and being one of the first teams to really bring it at least to the North American scrim meta, what do you think of its results? Obviously, TSM found fairly significant success with it running up into First Strike, but it fell short in those sort of final higher tier matches. Do you think that Triple Duelist as a sub-meta game has a future still, or do you think that sort of the cracks in its armor have been highlighted at a high enough level that it'll sort of fade into the background a bit?
I think, and at least in scrims, if I remember correctly, we had success, but it's scrims, so you can't always tell what exactly is going on. But I think in terms of if it can stay in the meta, or will it, or can it still beat, I think it's about what team picks it up and how they play it, because you have 4 duelists, right? So it's about what combination of them are you using? What are the supporting characters? So, for example, I guess one of the chinks in its armor, one of the problems with it is that you're dropping one high meta pick. For example, if you're doing triple duelist, depending on the map, of course, but you have to go Omen. Omen is pretty much standard. What you drop, you get Breach, for example. So that means you're dropping Sova, or you get Sova, that means you're dropping Breach. And it can work, for example, on Split because you can drop a Sova, but on other maps, you're dropping something that's very big. And I think it's just about the risk worth. Can you mitigate, that you're losing in the comp theory at least, Because if they have a Sova and you don't, they're ahead. So it's more about, can you mitigate that? Can you make it so that's irrelevant?
Yeah, you're basically crediting it with whichever team can pull it out and mitigate sort of the inherent compositional weakness that is going to come from bringing in a duelist over like a more utility heavy agent like a Sova or Breach.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
That will bring us at long last to the final step on this timeline, and that will be the introduction of Viper in EU on Bind. This is definitely one of the most recent ones, also really only appearing in First Strike, but to talk about it more, I have two of the pioneers of this pick, Mini and Boaster from Summon FC. Hello, guys. Thanks for hopping on with me. How are you both doing?
Pretty good, thank you.
Very well. How are you, Anders?
Doing great, thanks. So I'm bringing you on today because you have earned your slot on this timeline as a team that really brought in innovation into Valorant's metagame, especially towards the end of 2020 here. Specifically, you're bringing out of Viper on Bind during First Strike. Sort of kick us off, what was that catalyst that made you want to bring out Viper on Bind?
I just like making weird strats, and I felt like I could make loads of weird strats with Viper. I was like to Mini, we need Viper. And this was like way before she was even good. Like she was actually bad for a lot of the time.
I'd never really been a big fan of Viper, and Boaster was. And then Breach got buffed, and I already liked Breach anyway, and I pretty much kicked Boaster off of Viper. And then we basically played like loads of tournaments, and it got to the point where we'd kind of had close game with FPX about a month before First Strike. And we came to it, and Boaster basically said, look, I think we need something new. Viper's been buffed.
Meanwhile, I was always gonna bring Viper back. So I was in my little my side hustle, my side project. I was preparing stuff for Viper, like ideas. I used to do the wall across B site, which splits the site, but it was actually really dog. So eventually I found this new wall when Viper got buffed and you could shoot your wall through walls. And then I showed Mini it and I was like, yo, Mini, this is the wall. Like we use this for defaults and execute. We just gotta make sure we have Omen as well. And then he could the wall is just good for pressuring whilst we're doing stuff on the other side. And Omen smokes can also do cross map smokes too. And then Mini was like, oh, it could work. It could work. And then CT side, he was like, what do you want to do there? Like everyone's doing the Viper wall across B window. I was like, we can try it. So we made a bunch of setups with me and TSAC. And instead of Mystic playing Viper, we had me playing Viper just to test everything. Like because Mystic wouldn't have really a feel or an idea. So I wanted to test it and see like if it was actually viable with the B wall. And I was like, the way that what's his face did it, we did. I looked at his wall and I tried that and I just didn't think it was that strong. And we tried Doma doing it and Mystic doing it to get like a kind of idea, mainly because no one wanted to play Viper except me. So we just tried everyone and everyone was trial and testing this thing. And then I came up with this new wall on A. Mini at first was like, not sure.
Yeah, this made no sense. I still don't think it makes any sense, but it
It
works.
does. It does
It
make
makes no
sense.
sense to me. But
It's the wall. The idea of the wall was to bring it back to beta, essentially.
it was going really well on Viper at first in Prac, and then suddenly I think FPX kind of revealed that they were playing Viper, and everyone just suddenly started like kind of getting used to Viper, and it just seemed like something just wasn't working, and we were getting like absolutely dominated. I kind of hit the emergency meeting button and was like, look, we need to actually like work on this because we're just gonna get like absolutely rolled. So we spent a lot of time in the week kind of leading up to First Strike, changing quite a lot of like little things, and then it kind of worked quite well. I think the teams that we ended up cracking quite a lot kind of got used to our own stuff, whereas like
Yeah.
obviously the teams we're playing in officials were not like we hadn't practiced them. So like
Yeah.
the reason I kind of was into Viper was like less of a long-term strategy. Although like I think we're gonna still run it now. It was more like we're an unsigned team. People like we played a lot of tournaments and there's a lot of VODs. So anyone could watch our VODs and pretty much see how we played the Breach Brim stuff. And I thought we just needed something just completely like opposite and just cheese. Like Viper is really good to cheese. Like the way FPX play it is like not cheesy at all. They play it very kind of cerebrally. They play it like an Omen controller. Whereas like I was more excited about the idea of just having two like Molotovs that could be used for after plants or for just like, okay, you're gonna A execute and these two Molotovs just clear out 2 spots and get you a free kill if it hits anyone kind of thing.
Yeah, when I showed you the execute, because I'd say Mini's more of the in this team. Mini's more of the looking at what I made and critiquing it kind of thing. So I made like a bunch of weird executes and like Ferrari strats, as we call them, which are like super rush strats, and just weird kind of just we'll try us throw our Molotovs here and try this, try that, try this. And Minnie was like, this could work, let's just try it. And then we just tried it, and yeah, some of it did work, some of it didn't, some of it needed editing. And sometimes like Doma just chimed in with something which like spurred. Normally, like if someone says something, it like spurred more ideas, and I was like back to the drawing board. And then eventually we got to where it was in the tournament. It was okay, but it's going to be better.
And that will bring us to current day. I don't want to drag this video out too much longer as it's already ginormous, but I wanted to give a quick shout out to all of the people who helped make this video by contributing their thoughts. Doombros, Sala, Boaster, and Mini are all, as shown by this video, phenomenal elements within the scene, and the game wouldn't be where it is today if not for them. So massive thank you. I'll be linking all of their socials and links to their teams, etc. in the description down below, so please show them some love. And with that, I'm going to leave you with my closing thoughts on the year. Please enjoy. It's been a wild first year for Valorant.
They're gonna get past. Wardell gets 1, 2, 3.
Because pros don't fake it! Pros don't fake it!
And Latex follows up getting the second.
Kill after kill needs to go his way. They're gonna get on top of the spike.
This post-plant strength the Summon have, but actually Lowell gonna find 2 kills. He finds the third as well. He's up and down. Oh, that's 2 for Wardell. 1 more! Give it to him, Wardell!
That's gonna open up to Mystic. That's 1. That's 2. And a third!
And while it may feel like we've already built an incredible history for this game together, we're only getting started.